There is a silent force within human connection that shapes desire far more than words or gestures ever could. It is not found in constant giving nor in endless availability, but in something far more subtle and powerful, a boundary. This boundary is not rejection, it is not distance born from indifference, it is the quiet declaration of self-worth. When a person refuses to abandon themselves in order to keep another, something profound begins to shift. The dynamic changes not on the surface, but deep within the unconscious. The human psyche is drawn toward what it cannot fully possess. When everything is given freely, without resistance, the mind settles. It grows comfortable, predictable, and eventually disengaged. But when there is a limit, when access is not guaranteed, the unconscious awakens. It begins to question, to imagine, to desire. This is where attraction deepens into something far more enduring. A boundary creates space, and within that space, projection begins. The other person starts to fill the unknown with meaning. They begin to assign value, to create emotional significance that was never explicitly offered. What was once simple becomes complex, even consuming. But this only happens when the boundary is real. If it is inconsistent, if it bends under pressure, it loses its power. The psyche detects weakness instantly. True boundaries are not loud. They are not explained repeatedly. They exist without apology. They are felt, not argued. And this is what creates lasting attachment, because when someone encounters a person who cannot be easily controlled, easily accessed, or easily understood, something within them is stirred, not consciously but deeply. It activates the part of them that seeks meaning, challenge, and emotional depth. This is where love begins to take root, not in comfort alone, but in tension. There's also something else that emerges in the presence of a strong boundary: respect. And without respect, what people often call love cannot survive. Respect grows when a person stands firm in who they are, when they do not dissolve themselves to meet expectations. Paradoxically, it is this refusal to overgive that creates a stronger bond, because the boundary sends a message without words. I value myself and I will not disappear for you. And in that message, the other person is forced to rise, to meet that standard, or to lose access entirely. This is not manipulation, it is alignment. The most powerful connections are not built on constant closeness, but on the balance between presence and absence, between warmth and restraint, between giving and holding back. When this balance is maintained, something rare happens. The connection does not fade, it evolves, it deepens, it becomes something that lingers in the mind even in absence. And this is why the boundary must remain, not as a wall, but as a center, a place where identity is protected, where self-respect is non-negotiable, because once that center is lost, everything else begins to collapse. But when it is held firmly, quietly, and consistently, it creates a psychological imprint that is difficult to erase. And that is the boundary that makes someone not just stay, but feel something they cannot easily let go of. Self-respect as emotional authority is the inner foundation that determines how a person is treated, valued, and remembered in any relationship dynamic. It is not expressed through dominance or control over others, but through a quiet certainty that one's emotional world is not available for misuse, neglect, or inconsistency. When a person carries this authority, they no longer negotiate their worth through approval or attention. Instead, they embody it as a lived truth that does not require external validation. This form of emotional authority begins with recognition of personal value, independent of external response. It is the understanding that love, connection, and presence are meaningful only when they are mutual and respectful. Without this understanding, individuals often fall into patterns of overgiving, over-explaining, and over-attaching, which slowly dissolves their emotional position in relationships. Self-respect interrupts this pattern by introducing an internal boundary that says access must be earned through consistency, care, and sincerity. When emotional authority is present, silence becomes meaningful rather than fearful. Distance is not chased, and inconsistency is not rationalized into excuses. Instead, clarity is observed. This creates a shift in relational dynamics because the person is no longer reacting from insecurity, but responding from grounded awareness. In such a state, emotional decisions are not impulsive, but aligned with inner stability. Psychologically, this authority also changes perception. Others begin to experience the individual differently because unconscious signals of desperation or dependency are no longer present. Instead, there is a sense of groundedness that naturally commands respect. The absence of emotional overextension creates space for genuine connection rather than attachment formed through imbalance. Self-respect as emotional authority also protects against internal fragmentation. Without it, individuals often compromise themselves repeatedly, leading to emotional exhaustion and confusion about their own identity. With it, there is coherence between feeling, action, and boundary. This coherence is what makes presence powerful and unforgettable. In relationships, this does not create distance out of coldness, but establishes clarity of emotional terms. It becomes clear what is acceptable and what is not, not through confrontation, but through consistent behavior. This consistency forms the silent language of emotional leadership that others instinctively respond to. Ultimately, emotional authority rooted in self-respect transforms the entire experience of connection. It replaces anxiety with clarity, pursuit with presence, and dependency with grounded engagement, shaping relationships that are not driven by fear of loss, but by the conscious choice of mutual value and recognition. Scarcity creates psychological value because the human mind is deeply influenced by availability, limitation, and perceived access. When something is abundant and constantly available, it loses its emotional weight in perception. The mind adapts quickly to certainty, and what is predictable becomes less stimulating over time. Scarcity interrupts this comfort by introducing uncertainty, and uncertainty activates attention, curiosity, and emotional investment. In psychological terms, scarcity does not only refer to physical absence, but also emotional and energetic limitation. When attention, presence, or availability is not unlimited, the mind begins to assign greater importance to it. This happens because the unconscious interprets limited access as something valuable, rare, or significant. As a result, emotional focus increases, even without conscious intention. This mechanism is closely linked to desire formation. Desire is not only created by presence, but often intensified by absence. When access is unrestricted, there is no internal tension, and without tension, emotional engagement weakens. But when access is partial or inconsistent, the mind begins to fill gaps with imagination, interpretation, and projection. This internal activity amplifies emotional significance far beyond the actual interaction. Scarcity also influences how memory is formed. Experiences that are not constant tend to be remembered more vividly because they stand out against the background of normalcy. The contrast between presence and absence creates emotional markers that the mind stores more deeply. This is why intermittent connection often feels more powerful than continuous availability. However, scarcity is not about manipulation or artificial withholding. When used consciously or unconsciously in natural dynamics, it reflects balance rather than excess. Overexposure can weaken emotional impact, while balanced availability preserves value and meaning. The mind respects boundaries because boundaries create structure, and structure creates psychological clarity. In relational dynamics, scarcity often activates deeper emotional processing. A person may begin to reflect more, feel more, and question more when access is not guaranteed. This internal movement is where emotional attachment begins to strengthen, not through constant reassurance, but through the space where thought and feeling develop independently. At the same time, scarcity also reveals emotional dependency patterns. If someone reacts strongly to limited access, it often exposes the degree of attachment already formed. This is why absence can feel more intense than presence, because it removes the immediate emotional anchor and forces the mind to engage internally. Ultimately, scarcity shapes value not because something is objectively rare, but because the human psyche assigns importance based on emotional experience, contrast, and perceived meaning. What is not always present becomes more mentally significant, more emotionally charged, and more psychologically lasting, forming impressions that endure beyond immediate interaction. Mystery fuels the unconscious because the human mind is naturally drawn toward what it cannot fully define, predict, or control. When something is completely known, it loses its psychological tension, and without tension, curiosity begins to fade. Mystery preserves that tension, keeping the mind active, engaged, and emotionally responsive. It creates an inner space where interpretation replaces certainty and imagination becomes the primary driver of perception. The unconscious mind does not operate through logic alone. It responds strongly to symbols, gaps, and incomplete information. When a person or situation is not fully understood, the mind begins to construct meaning in order to fill the unknown. This process is automatic and deeply instinctive. It is not based on reality alone, but on perception shaped by emotion, memory, and desire. Mystery becomes powerful because it prevents closure. Closure gives the mind rest, but lack of closure keeps it engaged. In this state, attention does not settle, it circulates. Thoughts return repeatedly to what remains unclear, attempting to resolve what is incomplete. This repetition strengthens emotional imprinting, making the experience more memorable and psychologically significant. In relational dynamics, mystery often intensifies emotional projection. When a person cannot be fully read, understood, or predicted, others begin to assign meaning to their behavior. Silence becomes meaningful. Distance becomes symbolic. Small actions are magnified through interpretation. The unconscious fills the gaps with imagined narratives, often shaped by desire rather than fact. Mystery also preserves emotional energy. Overexposure reduces impact because familiarity eliminates surprise. But when something is gradually revealed rather than fully exposed at once, each moment carries weight. This slow unfolding allows emotional investment to build naturally over time, creating deeper psychological engagement. However, mystery is not about confusion or intentional concealment. It is a natural result of depth, complexity, and controlled self-disclosure. A person who is fully transparent at every level leaves no space for inner exploration. But a person who reveals themselves gradually allows the unconscious to remain active, continuously engaged in discovery. This engagement is what creates emotional depth. The mind becomes invested not only in what is known, but in what is yet to be discovered. The unknown becomes a psychological magnet, drawing attention repeatedly without conscious effort. Mystery also strengthens emotional attachment because it activates both curiosity and uncertainty at the same time. These two forces together create a powerful loop of attention, reflection, and emotional involvement. The mind keeps returning, trying to complete what remains unfinished, even when no resolution is immediately available. Ultimately, mystery fuels the unconscious by keeping perception alive in motion. It transforms understanding into exploration, certainty into imagination, and simple awareness into deeper psychological involvement that continues to grow through absence of full clarity. Independence strengthens attraction because it signals emotional completeness rather than emotional need. When a person is independent, they are not seeking others to fill an internal void, but engaging from a place of wholeness. This shift in energetic positioning changes how they are perceived, because attraction is deeply influenced by psychological balance rather than dependency. Dependence often creates pressure within relationships. It places emotional responsibility on the other person to provide validation, attention, or stability. Over time, this can lead to imbalance where one side gives more than the other, not out of genuine desire, but out of obligation or expectation. Independence removes this pressure by restoring emotional self-sufficiency, allowing connection to exist without burden. Psychologically, independence communicates strength. It shows that a person can function, grow, and maintain stability without constant external reinforcement. This creates respect, and respect is a foundational element of lasting attraction. Without respect, emotional interest weakens because the dynamic becomes one-sided or predictable. Independence also increases mystery and space within relationships. When a person is not constantly available, their presence carries more weight. Their time feels more intentional and their attention feels more meaningful. This selective engagement naturally enhances emotional value because the mind tends to prioritize what is not overexposed. At the same time, independence protects identity. In many relational dynamics, individuals unconsciously merge their sense of self with another person, losing clarity about their own needs and boundaries. Independence restores this clarity by maintaining personal direction, interests, and emotional stability outside of the relationship. This creates a grounded presence that is both stable and attractive. Attraction also deepens when there is no sense of emotional chasing. When a person is independent, they do not over-pursue or over-explain their presence. They allow interactions to unfold naturally rather than forcing connection. This absence of pressure creates a healthier psychological environment where interest can develop organically. Independence does not mean emotional distance or disconnection. It means the ability to be fully present without being emotionally dependent. It allows closeness without losing individuality and connection without sacrificing self-respect. This balance is what creates long-term emotional stability. In unconscious perception, independence is often interpreted as confidence. Confidence reduces uncertainty and increases trust in emotional dynamics. People are naturally drawn to those who are centered within themselves because it signals reliability, emotional maturity, and inner control. Ultimately, independence strengthens attraction because it transforms need into choice. It shifts the foundation of connection from dependency to mutual engagement, where both individuals participate not out of lack, but out of genuine interest and emotional alignment that grows stronger through freedom rather than attachment pressure. The shadow responds to resistance because the human psyche contains hidden layers of emotion, desire, fear, and unresolved experience that do not disappear when ignored. Instead, they become more active when confronted with limitation, rejection, or emotional boundaries. Resistance acts as a psychological trigger that awakens what is not fully conscious, bringing internal tension into motion. When a person encounters resistance, the mind does not remain neutral. It begins to react, question, and interpret. This reaction is not only logical but deeply emotional, driven by unconscious material that seeks expression. The shadow represents those parts of the self that are unacknowledged, suppressed, or not fully integrated. When resistance appears in external reality, it mirrors internal conflict and activates this hidden dimension. In relational dynamics, resistance often intensifies emotional focus. When access is limited or denied, the mind does not simply move on. Instead, it begins to attach meaning to the absence. This absence becomes psychologically charged, and the shadow responds by amplifying emotion, desire, or frustration. What is not immediately available becomes more mentally significant because it is no longer under conscious control. Resistance also disrupts emotional certainty. When something is easy and predictable, the psyche remains calm, but when it is uncertain or restricted, internal imbalance emerges. The shadow rises in response to this imbalance, attempting to restore emotional equilibrium through imagination, projection, or heightened attention. This is why emotional distance or resistance can feel more powerful than direct engagement. At the same time, resistance reveals hidden attachment patterns. The intensity of reaction often reflects the depth of underlying emotion. If there is little internal attachment, resistance creates minimal disturbance. But when emotional investment is already present, resistance activates stronger psychological responses, exposing what was previously unacknowledged. The shadow does not respond to logic alone. It responds to emotional tension, symbolic meaning, and perceived loss of control. Resistance creates all three simultaneously. It interrupts expectation, challenges assumption, and introduces uncertainty, which forces the unconscious mind into active participation. However, resistance is not inherently about conflict. It is also a boundary that defines structure within relationships and within the self. It creates distinction between self and other, between desire and limitation, between expectation and reality. The shadow engages with this distinction because it thrives in areas where clarity is incomplete. Through resistance, unconscious material becomes visible. Patterns of attachment, fear of rejection, need for validation, and emotional dependency are all revealed when access is not freely given. This exposure is not comfortable, but it is deeply revealing. Ultimately, the shadow responds to resistance because it is drawn toward what challenges internal equilibrium. It seeks resolution through engagement with tension, and in doing so, reveals the deeper emotional architecture that shapes perception, attachment, and desire beyond conscious awareness. Consistency builds trust and obsession because the human mind is structured to seek pattern, stability, and predictability in emotional experience. When behavior remains steady over time, the unconscious begins to relax its defenses. It no longer anticipates sudden emotional disruption, and in this stability, trust is formed. Trust is not created in intensity alone, but in repetition that confirms reliability. When a person is consistent in their actions, presence, or emotional tone, the mind starts to map their behavior as safe and understandable. This mapping reduces uncertainty, and reduced uncertainty creates emotional comfort. However, when this consistency is combined with emotional significance, it goes beyond trust and begins to form deeper psychological attachment. The unconscious mind pays attention to repetition more than occasional intensity. A single strong emotional moment may create impact, but repeated patterns create identity. When someone shows up in a reliable, steady way, their presence becomes embedded in memory. Over time, this creates emotional conditioning, where the mind begins to associate stability with safety and emotional importance. Consistency also removes internal conflict. In inconsistent dynamics, the mind is constantly trying to interpret changing signals, which creates confusion and emotional fatigue. But when signals remain stable, cognitive load decreases, allowing emotional space to deepen. In this space, attachment grows naturally because the mind is no longer occupied with uncertainty. Trust emerges first, but obsession can follow when consistency is paired with emotional depth. The mind becomes accustomed to a pattern, and once that pattern is established, it begins to anticipate it. Anticipation strengthens emotional focus because attention is repeatedly directed toward the same source. This repetition creates mental reinforcement, making the presence of the other person more psychologically dominant over time. However, consistency does not mean excessive availability or emotional overextension. It refers to alignment between words, actions, and emotional presence. When behavior is predictable in its authenticity, the mind interprets it as genuine. This perceived authenticity strengthens emotional investment because it reduces doubt and increases psychological security. At the same time, consistency creates familiarity, and familiarity often leads to emotional bonding. The more the mind encounters a stable emotional pattern, the more it integrates it into its internal structure. This integration is what allows attachment to deepen beyond conscious awareness. Obsession in this context is not randomness, it is the result of repeated emotional reinforcement. When someone becomes a steady presence in thoughts, emotions, and perception, the mind begins to circle back to them automatically. This repetition is not forced, but conditioned through consistency. Ultimately, consistency builds trust by removing uncertainty, and it builds obsession by reinforcing emotional presence over time. It transforms interaction into pattern, pattern into memory, and memory into attachment that persists beyond immediate experience and becomes psychologically enduring.